Welcome back to Liberty Bites on the Think Liberty Network. I'm your host, William Gadsden. You can follow me on Twitter at William_Gadsden and follow Think Liberty on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever your favorite social media outlet is. You can also follow me on Facebook at William Gadsden Political Commentator. Give us a follow and a like for updates on new episodes and more. We also have a Patreon now, so if you'd like to support our work, check it out at patreon.com/ThinkLibertyPatrons. So in this episode, I want to kick off a new episodic series concerning the Supreme Court and how its rulings throughout U.S. history have fundamentally, and perhaps even permanently, changed how we view and utilize the Constitution itself. But before we can get into the specific cases and the more detailed information concerning this huge issue, we need to talk about the basics. What is the Supreme Court? What is some of its history? What was the original intent of it? And what are some of the judicial philosophies that shape majority opinions, decisions, that come out of the court? We'll also cover a lot of terminology in this episode so that you can better understand the information that will be covered in the future episodes of this series. So let's dive in. As most of you took some sort of civics or government class in high school, you understand the concept of separation of powers within our government. So this is manifested in the three branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. We know that the legislative branch writes and votes on new bills to become law, and the executive branch either signs those bills into law or vetoes them. Those two branches are often at odds with one another and make no bones about their differences when they appear in public. But the judicial branch is a bit different. It operates as a neutral party to intervene between these two branches or between a private entity or individual and the government itself, and adds clarity to laws in various situations. But generally, the other two branches avoid direct conflict with the Supreme Court. After all, you don't want them to have a reason to be unduly influenced and potentially breach their supposed neutrality. But in giving the Supreme Court these responsibilities, they're also given a lot of power. These are unelected officials that are given the immense responsibility of interpreting the basis for every law of the country, whether it be federal, state, or local, by interpreting the Constitution itself. Founding Father Alexander Hamilton himself said of the Supreme Court, as it was being planned, quote, "The authority of the proposed Supreme Court of the United States, which is to be a separate and independent body, will be superior to that of the legislature. The power of construing the laws according to the spirit of the Constitution will enable that court to mold them into whatever shape it may think proper, especially as its decisions will not be in any manner subject to the revision or correction of the legislative body. This is as unprecedented as it is dangerous," unquote. So the framers fully understood the potential for this ostensibly politically neutral body to become tyrants in their own right, to interpret the Constitution not as it was written and intended, but how they wanted it to be. Which brings us into the first few terms that will come up in this series. These are called judicial philosophies. In other words, what lenses that justices on the Supreme Court use to interpret the Constitution and apply it to different court cases. The first is called legalism, the idea that justices' decisions should be based on the law and the application of the law. Now, within legalism and realism are several subcategories, the specific lenses that I mentioned. We'll get to those here in a second. So the second is called realism, and this is the idea that justices' actual votes in Supreme Court cases are inherently biased, driven by the preferred political outcomes of the justices. So, question for you. Which do you think is more applicable between the two? Not which one should be used, but which one is used. But I digress. Let's talk about the different kinds of legalism. The first is what is called original intent, the idea that the Constitution should be based on the intent of the framers themselves, based on their own writings and recorded history, and of course the Constitution itself. The second is similar to original intent, called original meaning or original understanding. This is the idea that the Constitution should be understood based on what the words meant at the time that they were written. The main difference between the two is that original intent is seen as more of a philosophical interpretation, one that isn't dependent upon historical context, whereas original meaning is. Next is one that is often heard, the idea of the living Constitution. Now, this idea holds that the meaning of the Constitution evolves with society, and that no amendment is required, merely a liberal reinterpretation of it, because we live in a society. The textualist is one that is less often used. Textualism is the idea that the Constitution is to be interpreted literally, in a word-for-word manner, no more and no less. Finally, the idea of judicial precedent, that the Constitution is influenceable and flexible, its application bending to previously made decisions and applications from other court cases. So which one do you believe is correct, and why? Just something to chew on here. Now, where realism is concerned, there are subgroups as well that specify how the court should hold itself accountable when deciding these cases, or whether they should hold themselves accountable at all. The first is ideology. The idea that while the judicial branch is supposed to be the least polarized or politically biased, we know that there is a clear pattern of left and right-wing Supreme Court justices based on the history of their judgments. The strategic approach is the idea that justices vote with the fact that outside actors will use their rulings to pursue their own political agendas in mind. The last two are polar opposites of one another. While judicial restraint is the idea that the Supreme Court should have as little direct influence on national politics as possible and instead defer to the other branches whenever possible, judicial activism holds that justices should do whatever they can within their power to protect what they believe to be just, even if the other branches disagree with their policy. Whew, okay, so that's a lot of information. But these are very important terms to understand as we move forward. And as we go through these different cases, you'll quickly learn to identify which philosophy was being used in the majority opinion, and from there draw conclusions on which way those justices leaned politically. It also goes a long way towards highlighting how easily disagreements can occur between justices themselves based on their differing choice of judicial philosophy. And of course, there are always outside actors as well that need to be considered, like public opinion, interest groups, the legacy of the court or of the justices themselves, or the actions of the other branches of government. The main point here is that on the outside looking in, it may seem to many as if the Supreme Court has a relatively easy job. Take a case, does it fit the bill according to the Constitution, hand down the majority opinion, and that's lunch. But from the inside, one quickly becomes aware of how incredibly complex these issues get. As you'll see when we get further into this series, the outcomes of many major Supreme Court cases end up creating ripple effects throughout the country, based on not only how to interpret entire amendments, but even down to interpreting different clauses and arguing about what individual words mean and why. It's really fascinating stuff, frankly something that I never saw myself being interested in. But it's like when you jump down the rabbit hole on Wikipedia or YouTube. You click on one video or article which leads to the next, and the next, and the next. And next thing you know, you're watching Swahili cooking videos instead of doing research for your school project. It happens. Anyway, I hope you'll join me next time as we go over one of the most important Supreme Court cases in the history of the court, Marbury versus Madison. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll come back next time to become more liberty-centered with us. I'm William Gadsden with Think Liberty.